Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for this session, which is entitled Toxic or Tonic, a sober appraisal of Hunter S. Thompson, Charles Bukowski, and the old school. We're very happy that you could be with us today as part of the 1455 Summer Festival hosted by 1455 Literary Arts. I'm Sean Murphy. I'm the executive director of 1455, and everything that we do to bring around free programming is a labor of love. Our mission is simply to celebrate storytelling and talk to storytellers. So this is the part of the job that is a real joy for me, because I get to, be around smarter people and hear them. So it's a real honor for me to bring these gentlemen to the festival and talk to them. So let me introduce them and we'll jump right in. Starting out is Timothy Denevi. His most recent book, Denevi. I knew I'd get it right. Denevi's most recent book is Freak Kingdom, Hunter S. Thompson's MANIC 10-year crusade against American fascism. He's also the author of Hyper, and his essay on politics, sport, and religion have recently appeared in Salon, New York Magazine, CNN.com, and Literary Hub. Below me in the Brady Bunch circle is Peter Richardson, who has written critically acclaimed books about Hunter Thompson, including Savage Journey, his most recent book, The Grateful Dead, and his essays have appeared in numerous outlets. A busy book reviewer, he received the National Entertainment Journalism Award for Online Criticism in 2013. He's been featured in documentary films, newspaper, magazine stories, podcasts, and public radio programs in both North America and abroad. Born and raised in the East Bay, he now lives in Sonoma County. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here. I'll just kick it off by saying, when we do a festival like this, a good chunk of the talent comes to us and it's a nice exchange, but there are the handful of panels that I curate and basically go out and recruit. So I just want to thank you both for taking the time and being agreeable so I could fanboy out a little bit.
My pleasure.
So
thank you for having us.
Absolutely my joy. I think in addition, if we're talking about toxic masculinity in general, but also kind of this notion of separating art from the artist, which seems, that's a perennial discussion, but really homing in on Hunter in particular and Bukowski in general, I think we can do some lifting today to really think about how, our political scene has not gotten any less crazy, and the bifurcation of both the literary and political worlds, continue unabated. And these two gentlemen that we're going to focus on were very prescient in the ways that they anticipated this and critiqued it decades ago. The way I would love to start out is by giving Peter full props. The real impetus of this conversation was a brilliant essay about Bukowski and his novel Post Office that I read in the LA Review of Books that was perfectly entitled Charles Bukowski's Lush Life, Post Office, and the Utopian Impulse. And as a legit fan of Bukowski's poetry and prose, it was an informative read. It was deeply refreshing. But what really caught my attention, and I don't want to frame the discussion, but the notion of utopian impulse, I think, is so on point. And it's something that normally, at least in my reading, would not be associated with a so-called bruiser like Bukowski. So I think that can get us into discussing two titans of American culture that are so easily rendered cliches, who were much deeper, much more soulful, and much more politically engaged than other people realize. So Peter, if you want to kick it off and just talk a little bit about your essay and your relation to Bukowski and this notion of a utopian impulse that informed his art.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Bukowski, of course, is super popular, not just here, maybe especially abroad, and not only for his fiction, but for his poetry. But Post Office was his first novel. By that time, he had been writing for these small literary journals, not really getting anywhere, living in flop houses, and low-wage jobs, including some work at the Los Angeles Post Office. And not really getting anywhere. He had a column in a weekly underground newspaper in Los Angeles, Notes of a Dirty Old Man. So there's something very kind of unhealthy and scabrous about this guy, So, and what I found very quickly was that his whole image seemed to be crafted as kind of the negative image of what Los Angeles as a city had been trying to project for many decades, really, as a kind of healthy, wholesome place for people to come and live the good life. And if you looked at Bukowski's actual life and the lives of his protagonists, the last thing you would say is that they were living the good life. But what I found after reading that novel several times is that he was very kind of secretly kind of smuggling in his idea of the good life. It's not most people's idea of the good life, and it's in stark contrast to the kind of image of Los Angeles that was prevalent at the time. And when you think of Los Angeles in the 1960s, especially white Los Angeles, you're much more likely to think of a group like the Beach Boys and cars and surfing and girls and fun and Disneyland even. But Bukowski was having none of that, especially Disneyland. He really hated Disneyland. And so, but what I found was that he was sort of secretly smuggling in this kind of, after taking everything down to zero, like really rubbing your snout in this kind of gritty underworld of Los Angeles that doesn't get a lot of attention. He really was kind of smuggling back in this idea of what the good life would look like, at least for him. And you're not really aware of it, but I think it generates a lot of the comedy, which is an important part of the novel. If you don't think it's funny, you're not going to like this novel at all. And I and a lot of other people do think it's funny, even though there's a lot of problematic stuff in it. I think that goes for some of the things that Hunter Thompson wrote as well.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, Peter. We were talking just a little bit earlier about California. I grew up in Los Gatos and San Jose. One thing I'll say is reading that article about utopianism and dystopianism in Los Angeles through Bukowski's lens really reminded me and made me think again of what San Francisco wanted to be in the early 1960s. As it was aspiring to be a national city. I mean, Norman Mailer's great 1964 piece on the convention, it begins with it was a beautiful city that's losing her beauty, and it goes into its attempts to modernize with these new hotels to be seen as this kind of international scene and place. But in that kind of late 50s, early 60s sense, there's another great piece by Roger Angell about the 1962 World Series, about how San Francisco wants to be a major league city. It really wants to be seen in that manner, and really wants to be seen even in a different utopianism of LA. It kind of, I think, positioned itself against it with more of the high ball / Manhattan-like aesthetic. And that tension between that kind of utopianism or ideal and its always gold rush nature of San Francisco from its very start. It's always being a place, as Thompson said, that you can strike sparks anywhere, and its kind of messiness. It has been something that I really always felt, but was perhaps better able to understand after the way you laid it out for Los Angeles so nicely. And it's such a Western theme, but then that will be different in each locale, especially the major metropolises of the 20th century that I think both Thompson and Bukowski have kind of not always seen to, but if you look at their writing, have come to represent.
One other thing or two other things I might add to the part about Los Angeles is that, in both San Francisco and in Los Angeles, the emphasis fell heavily on youth culture. And Bukowski was not a young man. He's showing you old, unhealthy people trying to do difficult jobs, and I think that even though I don't think he was explicitly political in the usual sense, I think there was a kind of politics embedded in the expression. But I think he certainly sided with the little guy and hated bureaucracy or hypocrisy. I guess the other point was that we're talking about the Great Society of the 1960s. And, for Bukowski, the post office was, the primary expression of the government, and they were putting him on the cross, as he would say, by forcing him to work 8 hours a day under difficult conditions after drinking all night and not getting enough sleep, So that's part of the comedy is he never goes back and reviews his own drinking. Maybe I would get through my workday a little more easily if I didn't kill myself every night with booze and no sleep. But but that again, that's part of the comedy, is that he's absolutely unwilling to accommodate, these the demands that are made on him by his employer or anyone else, really.
Yeah. Well, so to ease into the inevitable word political, for me, I mean, there's so much to tee up about that, but one of the two things that jump to mind for me anyway are, this notion of not only tipping over sacred cows, but really seeing through the nonsense. That I think the reason that these two writers remain so relevant is in our social media. I imagine what these two would have made of selfies and cultivated existence online. Bukowski was doing that lifting when it was just in magazines and movies. So there's that. But then as far as political, I don't want to be too reductive, but I see them as kind of mirror images, right? Like Hunter gravitated toward the political. That was his sweet spot. And Bukowski was more political in the Orwellian sense. I think of Orwell's quote that I always love to bring up, which is, anyone with the opinion that art shouldn't be political, that itself is a political statement. So I think they both had this political impulse tied in with the utopian impulse of critiquing the horse shit, but then trying to offer alternatives. And in that regard, like I said at the outset, they were really ahead of their time.
Yeah, I'm going to defer to Tim on this, because I think the arc of Thompson's career, which Tim traces in Free Kingdom so well, he doesn't start as a political guy. All of his fantasies are literary. And, he has political views, but they're not especially well informed. And only later, really, I would say after 1968, does he begin to target the political class, explicitly. Before that, he's really focusing on these kind of exotic West Coast subcultures, and sort of the way Tom Wolfe was doing. And, Tom Wolfe's work was political too, but I don't think if you look at Wolfe and Didion on the one hand and Thompson on the other, that you're going to find a lot of, shared political views. And Thompson was moving left in his own kind of idiosyncratic way. Mostly it was visceral, I think. I don't think you read Thompson for, new political ideas or evidence or arguments or anything like that, but it was really more, and I guess maybe he has this in common with Bukowski as well, it was like, it began with what he hated or who he hated. And I think in a weird way, I think that's why it survived so well, because it was so personal and then and so hyperbolic and over the top, but it ends up being kind of prophetic because he was right about those people. And it took a little time for everyone else to figure that out.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to phrase it. One of the beauties of a writer like Mark Twain or a writer like Thompson is that somehow, even all these years later, the context of what they're indicting remains in their act of indictment. So you understood that it wasn't just this expression of disease or distaste or anger or outrage, but he also, in a very authentic way, characterized who was outraging him and what he found to be so distasteful and dangerous. And I think that evolved. I think at first he was a long way from what was going on in the power centers of America, both publishing wise, which Peter, you talk about in your book, I think in a really illuminating way, and also politically. The politics of the West, as you've written in your other books in the 1960s, it was an outpost. It was a long way from the center. It took a long time to get back to Washington. News came later. The editions of the newspaper would be delayed. It wasn't as far as Honolulu, but it still could feel like a very long way. And that being said, I think the dual trajectory of him honing his sort of moral outrage, of it becoming more specific in his writing. You see it in his letters too, how he begins to write letters to Lyndon Johnson. He begins to write letters to other people and the outrage that he feels. And also the success that he had by beginning with that kind of milieu of the counterculture and of more exotic figures, that opening up the question of where to go next and what to do, because the 1960s were such kind of unique cyclone. All the air kind of drafted in that direction. Suddenly he had the means that he may not have in the past to go somewhere like Chicago, which he wasn't even technically covering. He just got his editor to get him a pass, and to not just get on the campaign trail later, but to begin to write the Nixon article for Pageant, and to begin to do these other more explicitly political assignments. And that wasn't necessarily available to him in the early 1960s. He had, gone throughout South America. He had gone across the West. But that's a big jump. And so after 1968, I think you see that kind of, twining together of his precision in targeting who he finds outrageous in the American political spectrum, whether it's a police chief, in a small town, or a party boss, or vice president, and also the means, because of his success and how hard he worked, to be able to then go to the, as he would say, the central nerve of some of these events. I mean, his writing about Nixon's inauguration is just startling. You get the sense of how things have changed between maybe March of 1968 and January of 1969. And I think that's insightful for our own times too, the way how quickly we can feel events happen kind of in real time in front of us. And so it is a complicated journey. And I think that's why, Peter, I enjoy your book so much, is because whatever, it's not just our discussion now, but it's not just these two figures, but it's in the way we discuss them that we tend not to include, these most essential aspects of context and background and motivation and limitation that created Thompson to become the writer that he is, and led Bukowski to become the writer that he is.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that, Sean, because, in many ways, I think you really have to sit with Thompson's life and work and correspondence and all that to see that, even as late as 1970, after he'd already written a best-selling book, he really didn't know where to go next and wasn't really sure about that, or who was going to print it, or, he was getting his stuff rejected by Playboy magazine and Sports Illustrated. And, we think of him now because he's been a cultural icon for so long, but I mean, he really needed to figure that out, and there weren't any obvious answers. I mean, a year later, he knew his course, and he ran it. He really did. But I don't think he could have done it without the editors that he worked with. First, Carrie McWilliams before, then Warren Hinkle, very importantly, and then even more importantly, Jan Wenner. I mean, without Rolling Stone, I'm not sure that we would be talking about him today. And I think in a way you could say that as well about Bukowski. If John Martin hadn't come along and given him whatever it was, $150 a month or whatever it was, I forget now. It was very modest.
Right.
And they had this agreement. I mean, he had been publishing in these forgettable magazines for a long time and not really getting anywhere with it. So his tenacity was really impressive. And I also think that Thompson's, and we tend not to see this now, but every step he made was kind of a step into the unknown.
Yes.
For a while there were no guarantees that he was going to be as successful as he became. And sometimes we have to remind ourselves of that by going back and looking at just how fragile that achievement was.
Yeah, and so
I mean,
go ahead, then.
No, just a quick add. I think that's exactly right, Peter. And it reminds me of something James Salter once said, that gets reframed, but he said, Salter was a novelist who was a friend of Thompson's that Peter and I have both written about in relationship to Thompson. But he, what Salter said is the key to making good art is easy. Discard everything that's good enough, which is terrifying. And I rephrase it too as, the most important role for a writer is to distinguish what's necessary from what's not. And that's a process that takes so many years. And you see Thompson struggling with that in the late 60s after Hell's Angels. What's his next project going to be? His sentences are at their peak. He's writing every day. He hasn't yet kind of, fallen victim to some of the physical infirmaries he'll have later in his life. But he's still, at that moment, he's not sure if he's going to do a collection of essays. He's not sure if he's going to do a satirical novel. I mean, he's really, really struggling to figure out in that tumultuous moment what's necessary, from what's not. And just to add to one more thing Peter said, I had a poet tell me a long time ago, it's something that I've always remembered, is that, we don't tend to realize that a book is something bigger than one person can make or produce. And without the perspective of other people, from editors to friends in the creative community, it can't and won't take the form that maybe readers eventually see or enjoy. And I think with both writers, that's such an important point that can get lost when we look at their personas from half a century later.
Such great insights, gentlemen. A couple of really quick bullet points. So I think it's worth underscoring and grounding kind of the myth of these two writers, that neither of them were shot out of a cannon. I think this is important in terms of when we talk about craft, especially at 1455. There was years of practice. So that's just always important to remember. But I also loved, and listening to you two, it's kind of crystallized in my mind something I never really thought of, which is they had already kind of come of age. So they already completely understood the fantasy of the Leave It to Beaver 50s, but they were wary of the hippies, we're going to solve everything. And they straddled that, and so once they became successful, they didn't sell out. I think that is part of what makes them endure. But Tim, I would defer to you, or both of you, but whenever I encounter someone that's like, Hunter Thompson, really? Like the Fear and Loathing, I'm like, if you want to understand the man and what followed, and not just in his career, but all the copycats, to me, it comes back to the Kentucky Derby is decadent and depraved, because I feel like that's when he started to find the voice of, I do need to dial it up a notch because this is so surreal and absurd. The old rules no longer apply. So I think that there was a sense of the craft developing in real time. Am I on the right track, or feel free to riff on any of none of that?
I have a thought on that, because I actually like the Kentucky Derby piece a little better than Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, because a couple of reasons. One is that even though it's, of course, fewer people have read it probably, it is the first piece of gonzo journalism. We can talk a little bit about what makes it journalism. I think the hybridization of the fiction and the nonfiction is a really important thing to understand about his work, and Tim really teases those out perfectly. But I think with Kentucky Derby, first of all, it's the first time he works even and meets with Ralph Steadman's, and that's an indispensable part of Gonzo's success, for a lot of different reasons that we can discuss downstream if you like. But the other thing is that he really knows Louisville, and it's not enemy territory for him. I think Las Vegas is enemy territory, and it's a little bit like shooting fish in a barrel for him. That's Nixon country. So he can make fun of it, and it's funny. But I think his treatment of Louisville, where he grew up, is even more kind of mordant and on point, and not more on point, but just more trenchant somehow. And the other thing about it is that he thought it was a failure. He didn't realize that piece was kind of going to be the beginning of his most important literary asset, Gonzo. Of course, nobody called it that until later. And the other thing about it is that it's self-reflective. At the very end, you remember of that piece, they've been searching for this perfect image of this kind of deracinated, unhealthy kind of whiskey gentry in Louisville. And he sees his own face in the mirror and realizes that after a weekend of boozing, that was the face they had been looking for. So in other words, he's sort of complicit in the stuff that he's critiquing. And that self-reflectivity, I think, is really makes it better, because at the same time he's characterizing this mayhem at Churchill Downs, but at every once in a while he drops something in about what's going on in the national political scene after reading the paper, and it's Vietnam, and it's the Black Panthers, and it's Kent State, and you realize that the mayhem we're seeing is nothing compared to the sheer lethality of what the American government is doing. And so you realize that there's a kind of figure-ground relationship, that the backdrop is even crazier than what we're seeing at Churchill Downs. And I think that all of that sort of adds up to a more effective piece for me, though of course I love Fear and Loathing, and it was the much more important work in his overall body of work.
I mean, yeah, I can't, I couldn't agree more. I think that especially in that piece, there's scenic moments where, Ralph Steadman is looking at the entire crowd while the crowd is singing the pledge or the national anthem. Somebody screams like, "Turn around, you hairy fuck." But that just gets that Thompson's idea of, where his gaze is going. He's looking back at all the people looking out, and that's so essential to what I think, and we've talked about this, what he did so well is that he wrote about people that had more power than him and that abused it. And it could be the person who in Louisville made other people's lives difficult, including his own. It could be the National Guardsman with a gun on a hill at Kent State. It could be the administration's choice to bomb Cambodia, and Laos, which is what we get at the beginning of that essay too. It's all happening during it. And one thing that you brought up, Peter, that I think is really important too and gets forgotten with Thompson is that he wrote about complicity within that process and never shied away from it, whether it's his own complicity or the complicity of his profession. And he would develop it more with the complicity of the press, where he's looking at the press while the press is looking at Nixon within that kind of inner circle. And he never shied away from his own complicity, later too. And I think that you see the original germ of it right there at the beginning. And I think that exists today. We see people indicting political classes, political figures on both the left and the right. And they deserve that indictment, but you rarely see the contextual acknowledgement of either the role of the press or the role of that person saying it, within it. And he didn't hesitate to point out that, like, just one weekend in Louisville, and this is what he looks like. And Stedman even worse, you might argue. And that kind of honesty and the humor built into it, but the kind of relentless critique of power, of people with more power and their abusive use of it is so essential to my understanding of why I'm attracted to his work and why I love that essay specifically too.
Yeah, it's really dripping with moral judgments, and that's what makes it so hard to sort of run the police tape around the work and say, let's not spend too much time thinking about him and his shortcomings. We'll just focus on the work. You can't really do that with him because the person and the persona and the work are so bound up together that you just have to acknowledge, that he would never refrain from drawing a moral judgment, so it's perfectly okay, I think, to read his stuff and get indignant. Some of it doesn't hold up very well, certainly, some of it is offensive, certainly more offensive now than it was then, but it was transgressive then. We have to kind of remind ourselves of that as well. So I think both with Thompson and with Bukowski, they're moralists. I mean, you mentioned James Salter, Tim, and he's the one who said that Thompson was a moralist disguised as an immoralist, and I think you can say the same thing about Bukowski as well.
Yeah, I mean, if I would suggest that the through line, right? We've certainly touched on the utopian impulse and how that ties art and observation together, as well as obviously the deep political impulse. But I was going to kind of cheekily say, we're talking about the T word, not toxic, but I think what motivated both of them, even or after they had success, they were both obsessed with the truth. Whether it was looking at themselves, looking at the political scene, looking at the hippies, etc. Neither of them shied away. And as quaint as that might sound, boy, does that resonate in 2022 as, those are rare breeds, especially once you've been admitted in to whatever the room is, the press room or the Churchill Downs, to still be unwavering in pointing out bullshit and being willing, as they both were, to put the lens on themselves. I think truth is the one word I'd use ultimately, maybe to describe both of them.
Yeah, I think that's certainly the value proposition to the reader. I'm going to give you the unvarnished truth as I understand it. There's no sense that, it's an objective truth or that, anything like that or some sort of universal truth. It's always super grounded in their own personal experience and observations. So you can take it or leave it, really, in some ways, but you never doubt that they're trying to tell you what they think they're not kind of, skirting any of the big issues or trying to prettify any the stuff that they're talking about. And that meant, especially in Thompson's case, that there was a huge sort of vein of media criticism that was kind of built into his work. And I think that where that really comes out most strongly, and whereas virtuosity really shows, is with the Campaign 72 book, because again, this is one of those things that I had to sort of sit with it for a long time, but I really realized that going into that assignment, he really didn't have any of the assets that most of those journalists had going into that. I mean, he really had to think of something different. And luckily, he had ready access to what was different about it, which was he was just going to go in there and work as close to the bone as he normally did. And I think that delighted Rolling Stones readers. Eventually it would delight even more readers, but I think that was perfect for that readership at that time. They were going to listen to him before they listened to, Harry Reasoner or Huntley and Brinkley or people like that, because I think they thought they would learn more if they read Thompson.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And it reminds me of, with Bukowski and with Thompson, the question of, what is personal narrative? What is memoir? And when is it effective? It's a mode. It's something that can be combined with and attached to and worked in and out of a larger subject-based investigation and analysis. We've seen, of course, writers for the past 100 years and long before that switch between modes and do this. But what I think is important is that neither of these writers pulled any punches or gave short shrift to the act of creating good personal narrative. What makes good personal narrative? There's authenticity, whatever that is, which is different for each person. But even more than that, there's the idea that there's something bigger than just the expression of pain on the page, that it has to go beyond a performance of outrage. But, it has to include these moments of when the camera turns, and it turns back on the self, or if it's been focused on the self, it turns back out. And it's that movement between, which Thompson was so great at it, even if it was only like a day later, the Thompson at the typewriter and the Thompson who just moved through the scene, and how they're already beginning to be different. How what Thompson got wrong while reporting is different from what Thompson understands sitting down at the typewriter to make a narrative out of it. It's within that space that there's something more than authenticity. There's an engagement that you talk about, Peter, where the readers at Rolling Stone feel that there's an intimacy, being created right there. It reminds me of the beginning of Orwell's, Shooting an Elephant, when it says, if he puts his arm around you, he's like, and I'm paraphrasing, there's a time in my life where I had the chance to be hated. I was popular enough to be hated by a large number of people, when I was in Burma. And you really, really just feel a sense of self-awareness and honesty, but also perspective, a changing perspective that's going to let you see what it was like in the moment and let you see what it was like later. Bukowski, the way that his poetry included personal narrative and never really went into that realm of craft that can become so popular within the play. His craft was there, but he never abandoned the personal in the pursuit of craft. I think that's a common denominator for both of them also, and it's hard to do. I think you're right, Peter. You opened up that issue in 1972, and you're reading, all the writers that are on the campaign with him, and they all have like their 500-word reprinted columns that are going to be in every local newspaper, but that everybody will have a chance to read. And there's something so vibrant and honest and human about Thompson's perspective, and different than when Mailer would give his 15,000 word great long form pieces at the end of the conventions or at the end of the election season. Thompson was giving you these dispatches each week, and it in a sense similar to Michael Herr, who put them all together, but I think much more so forged a connection with his readership that we tend to forget nowadays too, because we experience it in so many different forms in that original opening of the magazine and reading the piece.
Yeah, and I think in general, if we're in 1972, especially with young people, they know many knew they were being lied to by the government, had been lied to about the origins of the war and the conduct of the war. And yet that was kind of an open secret by 1972. So why would we trust the media, which was sort of legitimizing and sort of supporting the government, not directly, but just indirectly through these routinized kind of forms of journalism. There wasn't really any effort to expose the lies the way Woodward and Bernstein, for example, would eventually do. But that was the exception. I think we think now back on that time as a time of great investigative reporting, and it certainly was. A lot of those were whistleblower stories. You had to find somebody to tell you what was going on. It almost didn't happen, right? I mean, we came very close to not having Woodward and Bernstein, and so there was all this ferment, and Thompson was part of a larger kind of media movement. But I think there was a kind of tone of iconoclasm that was coming into journalism during that time that I don't think you would have found 10 years earlier.
Yeah, I mean, they kind of had to invent the language to match the times. One of the other things that frustrates me, right? And again, it's a good problem to have. You become iconic, and I appreciate your use of the word iconoclast. I think it's spot on with both of them. But we've got now movies, right? With Matt Dillon, Mickey Rourke, Johnny Depp, Bill Murray. They're themselves icons. So it is hard to peel away. But I guess I'm at great pains to. We talked about the political impulse, the utopian impulse, the craft element of refining that. But both of these guys cared. And I think that's another thing that separates and why their best work doesn't just endure. It stands tall in American letters, in my opinion, because neither of these guys ever phoned it in, at least in their primes. When they were doing their best work, there wasn't an ounce of manufactured outrage or cynicism, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we love Bukowski's heroes because they don't care. There's a way that they'll go ahead and say, oh, whatever. You want me here at 5 tomorrow at 100-degree heat, to carry letters because the regular guy won't come in when it's hot. Okay, whatever. You write me up. Go ahead. It's really one of the great. And even though I don't think he was that. I think he was very skeptical and almost averse to kind of political messaging. I don't think he had any interest in that. He hated. I don't think he liked the counterculture at all. Unlike Thompson, who I think saw something of value there and attached himself to it, though he was no flower child. But Bukowski, I think it's his kind of it's his hero's blasé nature. World wise, world weary. That's what makes the comedy kind of work. But I what's exactly right about Thompson is that, and I learned this from reading Matt Taibbi, is that he really did care, especially on the campaign reporting. You could never call him cynical. He really cared about the outcome in a way that a lot of the reporters I don't think did. I mean, he was really living and dying with the process and the outcome, and he was exposing himself in that way. He was making himself vulnerable in a way that a lot of hardened, veteran journalists would be unwilling to do, because the last thing they wanted to appear as is naive, And I don't think Thompson was afraid of that, even though he was probably, the least savvy political reporter on that beat. He made up for it in a way with passion, and I think that comes through to his readership in exactly the right way, and still makes it readable today, even though it's about an election 50 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and I was reading through Peter's book again, and when it comes to fame and it comes to sincerity and authenticity, I thought about Teddy White, who you talk about, who wrote The Making of the Presidency, and I don't think fame in any way hindered Teddy White's ability to make the book he wanted to make. He always was just trying to get closer or more inside, and he never really changed his views. Like in '68, seeing the protesters who supported Bobby Kennedy getting beat up and thinking of them as the aggressors. Fame and success never really affected what he had to say, in my opinion, because he already was in a more generalized space, and he wasn't willing to be wrong necessarily in the same way. He'd talk about it, but not in the same way. He was an insider, from the start, the kind of one of the ultimate insiders that just got more inside. And Thompson with fame, it's the exact opposite. so central to Thompson's experience, I think, is the physicality of the place around him and his culture, whether it's San Francisco and then often in Los Angeles, when he's down reporting there, and when he was in the presidential election, often following Nixon, there, and to suddenly not be able to be anonymous, to not be able to, be in the group, but maybe outside the group, but still the people around you don't see a difference between you and them in a kind of a sensible way, took away that ability to, I think, say what he wanted to say, and probably interfered with the process of his movement towards being able to express it. And that's because of, again, where he began. And another writer beginning at a different place or trying to say something differently is not going to be affected by that lack of anonymity or that fame. And it must have been so difficult, and I think of it as if you're trying to sit down, you're interrupted, and you're trying to do this and you're interrupted. And so much of his reporting was watching what was going on around. And those moments where he was kind of shocked, because I think he dramatizes moments of realization, moments of insight that he had while reporting so well. And I wonder if those could occur in the same way once, the 15 to 25-year-olds, gathered outside the event are screaming your name, and trying to get your attention and interfering with the story themselves by reaching out to you.
Yeah. I think he and Jan Wenner called the end of each story was called The Wisdom. And it was the thing, I think, that one could draw from these experiences, many of which he sort of, especially over time, began to create himself, right? He would instigate a story that he would then report on. But there's a lot to be said about him as a reporter. I'm not sure that's the right term. He rejected it. He did think of himself as a journalist. It's really interesting when you dig down and look at these modes and how he was combining them. And he had been wanting to do that for a long time. And, he had been reading Henry Miller, and he'd been reading Jack Kerouac, and I think he really admired the way that and Orwell, and maybe Jack London I would throw in there, although I don't think Thompson was reading London carefully by that time. But the ability, the participatory reporting, and then the ability to turn those experiences into fiction was something, and then sell it, which Kerouac was able to do. All of them were able to do, and Mailer too was another big, huge influence. So, he was coming at it from the place of a fiction writer, but he spent most of his time, writing nonfiction, for magazines. But I think as many people have pointed out, and Tim and I do it too, he really felt like certain kinds of truth, maybe the most important kinds, are most accessible through fiction, and that you'd really have to shrug off the who, what, when, where approach to journalism if you're really going to get at that. And new journalism gave him that opportunity early on, and then Gonzo took it to another level.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you gentlemen this. It's a pretty open-ended question, but to me, I think this recurring theme of earning access through talent and hard work, but remaining an underdog, I would say is an ability or a passion, obsession that is lacking in a lot of today's political and literary writing. Are there writers that are able to do this, kind of carrying that torch, or is that everything's access now, right? And I don't want to go down that rant about our political, the White House press corps, but back then you got access, for the spoils, but you got access so you could get into the story. And I just find that, generally speaking, that's somewhat lacking today, and that's why maybe there's distrust or more distrust and cynicism about the media.
Yeah, I have a thought on that. I mean, I think there wasn't the sort of awareness of media criticism then that there is now. I think Thompson and Tim Krause and some others kind of helped create that or forge that subfield of journalism. But the thing that you have to remember, I think, with Thompson is that he I just forgot my thought. Sorry. Go on. Let's go on to the next thing. I'll think of it in a second.
Well, No, I think, I think it's interesting to think today. It's such a complicated space. I always think of the dig against, the dig against like, some of the writers in the 20th century, and it was either against Mailer or it was against, I think it was against Cheever. It was, he never had an unpublished thought. And it was against Updike. Yeah, it was against Updike. He never had an unpublished thought. And I think you see that in some of the media figures with access today. I mean, I've never been in the same room, but Bob Woodward, there's just such a vampiric nature to him, where if there's any blood in that room, he's going to drink it, and then he's going to tell you about it. He's never had an unpublished thought. Similar to that kind of quip about Updike. And I think that's kind of predicated on access. Washington, just like how the West was further away, Washington was a more closed off town, I think 50 years ago. I live a few blocks from where Thompson lived on Juniper Avenue now, when he came in, reported in 1972 on the election. And this has just become a town, well, it still has its own characteristics, that celebrity, Silicon Valley, other types of money move through. And so access has created new kind of dividers, where Thompson would go and swim in, Ethel Kennedy's pool, over Chain Bridge Road in Virginia. He was with Dick Goodwin, drinking, with insiders and elites, and there was a different kind of way in, I think, than now. And it's something that we've lost, and it's also something that he brought to the table that's different. Like this is kind of a non sequitur, but it reminds me. I'll go to CPAC. I was there on like January 6th, which Peter wrote about. He was writing the foreword to his book on that date. And long story short is I'll see the reporter Jordan Klepper, who is for The Daily Show, does these segments where he interviews people from across the political divide. And what Klepper actually does is, I think, similar to what Thompson must have been like in those moments. The only way you can be in those scenes, even if people know you and you're beginning to be recognized, is to listen and to kind of focus. And when you get the clips later in The Daily Show, it's always Klepper challenging the people that he's talking to, or the funny quip, or what's going on. But for the hours that he's getting the footage, he's really sitting there and nodding, and he's really sitting there and listening for minutes and minutes at a time before he begins to interrupt and say, well, what about this? And I imagine that Thompson was similar in that way too. And that gets to, insider, outsider. Once you really do become an insider, it's hard to kind of pull off the Joan Didion move of sitting there and being quiet until people get very awkward and then begin to tell you all their secrets again and again and again. You can't do that if you're an insider. You have to contribute to the conversation. You have to forward it. You have to help Bob Woodward find the blood that he's looking for, and continue in his mini millennial run as chief vampire. So, it's complicated, but I think it is important to point out that difference between them and them.
I remembered my thought. Thank you for I'm still a little jet lagged here from this trip, but the thought, it has to do with Rolling Stone, and Thompson really pioneers this, I think, in many ways, is that, it's a rock magazine, and they have a business model. Jan would never call it that. He would call it a mission, but they had a business model. They could sell advertising to music labels, and that allowed them to do things that Ramparts magazine and other previous magazines, and later ones too, were not able to do. Political magazines lose money. Rolling Stone made money, and that allowed them to do some political stuff. And then the political stuff, it tends to be very important, but they're not going back. They're not beat reporters that are going there and have to live with these sources for next year and the year after that and the year after that. That means they can do much. They can do big stories and write things that other outlets can't really write, because it's not sustainable for their business operation. And I don't think that's well understood. And I don't think Rolling Stone gets enough credit for all the important investigative stories they've done over the years. It really starts with Thompson. They had won some National Magazine Awards before that on some very solid journalism about Altamont and Charles Manson. But with the arrival of Thompson, who never really writes about music, even though it's a music magazine, they get something that other music magazines don't have, but they also get something that other political magazines don't have. And that is, it has to do with that outsider status that can be a disadvantage. It could have been for Hunter Thompson on the 1972 campaign trail, but in an act of judo, he turns it into an asset. You know, it's an asset that he doesn't owe these people anything and can write whatever he wants about them. And I think that's what readers are often looking for and can't get it because of the realities of daily beat journalism, whether it's on Wall Street or Washington, D.C. or the Pentagon or the state capitol or anywhere else. The journalists know that they talk about it at the bar every night, and they swap stories, and they want to hear them, but they're not going to write them in these narrow kind of hard news formats that their editors want from them. Objective, of course.
And especially with how things have changed over the last 20 years, where those jobs are so rare, you know, for them to get. They're not about to throw it in the air and risk losing it, you know. And I'll just add, Peter, that I think that Strange Rumblings in Ozatlan by Thompson is my favorite piece, you know, by him when it comes to writing about people with more power, when it comes to writing about what's necessary from what's not. You know, if he were even a resident of Los Angeles, I think it would have been much harder to write that piece. You know, when he talks about the LAPD's ruthlessness and that moment where he dramatizes if they're willing to kill him, wants to stop them from killing me for investigating him, and how difficult it is to then accept that they may have killed Ruben Salazar because of the jeopardy it puts him into. You know, that kind of moment, I don't think you can get if you're a beat reporter or enmeshed, you know, even more. I don't think you can feel it. I'm sure you can feel the threat, but I don't know if you can dramatize it, you know, the same way he did. And that makes the combination of investigation and commentary and dramatization in that article and so engaging and really, you're right, setting the foundation for what Rolling Stone could do early on.
Yeah, and as you guys know, it was in the middle of reporting that story that the assignment to go to Las Vegas comes up. I mean, that was another aspect of the almost serendipitous quality of his career, so that this really incredible story that he writes, Strange Rumblings in Aslan, you know, it's not overlooked. I mean, it's bundled together with some of his important stuff in the Modern Library series, for example. But it's not half as well remembered as Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, which comes up in the middle of that and is rejected by Sports Illustrated for good reason. But I mean, it's always there's this very unpredictable quality to his work. I think it's only then that he began to realize that GONZO journalism was his calling card. And, you know, until that time, he worried that the Las Vegas piece would actually diminish his credibility as a working journalist. He didn't, I mean, which is odd because this is a guy who really, as a freelancer, really knew the marketplace for the things he was writing and was very attuned to it, you know, always haggling and bitching about money. And then suddenly I think the light went on that this is it. This is the thing that I can do that other people aren't doing, that people will pay for, you know, and then of course it turns into lecturing and films and a lot of other things. And I would argue maybe Tim and you agree, Sean, is that, you know, the writing after a while really begins to suffer. And the editorial help that he gets is incredible, I think, kind of unprecedented, for reasons that Tim really uncovers early on with the importance of dexedrine and the combination of dexedrine and alcohol in his writing process. So, you know, that begins not to work, and then, you know, develops an appetite for cocaine. That doesn't work at all. And then you enter this kind of late period where you know, his model of authorship, I think, is virtually unique, really. I can't think of anybody that got the kind of support that he got. Even so, you know, despite marshaling all of this editorial talent, nobody could create a masterpiece of GONZO, you know, because it was so bound up with him and his experience and his voice.
Yeah, so generous. Tim, lamentably, we're just about out of time, but a final thought from you?
Yeah, you know, I had always we have that question of the kind of Faustian bargain, and it applies to maybe both these authors, but the lived experience, putting your hand close to the flame to be able to articulate it better than anybody, but then having to deal with the damage that you may accrue, and then how long you'll be able to kind of sustain it and express it. One thing I've thought about during our conversation, and after reading Peter's book too, is part of the bargain for Thompson was also that he was always willing during these climactic years of the last century to go and be at the center of what was happening, to get on the plane and go to Chicago, to be at the inauguration, to be at these like key moments in American history. He was off. I mean, the night Watergate happened, he was drinking in the bar, which may or may not be apocryphal, but he lived right in that town. He was so close to all of it. And I think that eventually begins to wear down too, not just because you have to take these perhaps other things to sustain that energy to get on the plane, to go, to be at these places, but because they no longer hold the same allure or newness or vibrancy that they did that first time you went to the convention and were on the floor, the first time you went to the inauguration, that, when the president is resigning, being in the town during that. And I think the world kind of browned out a little bit from experience. And I had never seen until recently, or thought till recently, that, his skill at being at the center of these moments was also what probably made those future moments, not as alluring, engaging, to him. And that's a complicated space. And again, gets to how lucky we are to have that output sometimes that we did get, and how, as Peter says, so many different things could have happened to it, not even his avoir not even to have amounted to what it is today.
Yeah. Well, listen, gentlemen, as advertised, a lot of knowledge dropped, a lot of inspiration discussed. For those of you watching, I don't know how you couldn't be intrigued, but if you really do want to take a deeper dive, I cannot more enthusiastically recommend Freak Kingdom and Savage Journey. Tim, Peter, I thank you for being here. I appreciate learning from you. I appreciate you taking the time, and I appreciate the work that you do on behalf of all the things that we're discussing today. So I hope we talk again soon, but it was a real joy.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks for putting it together.
Absolutely, my pleasure. So thanks everyone for joining us for Toxic or Tonic. We're so pleased you spent time with us. We hope the discussion has been worthwhile. Check us out at 1455litarts.org, and you can find out more about this festival, more about what we do, and check out the books by our guests. Cheers.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Sean.